Right, so we've got this huge pile of sources here, all about revolutionary Cuba.
Yeah.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at women's lives after Castro came to power.
Right.
We've got academic books, we've got historical accounts, we've even got glimpses into daily life through things like reports from the Federation of Cuban Women.
The FMC.
CFMC, yeah.
Yes.
So did the revolution actually deliver on its promise of equality for women?
Well, that's what we're here to find out.
Let's find out.
It's fascinating, right? Because we're not just looking at laws on paper.
Yeah, right.
We're trying to understand how things actually played out for women.
Yeah, the reality.
Did their everyday experiences match the official narrative?
Exactly.
That's what we're going to be uncovering in this deep dive.
So to get the full picture, we need to rewind a bit.
Yeah?
What were things like for Cuban women before 1959, before the revolution?
Well, imagine a life that's largely confined to the home.
Okay.
Work was scarce, if you could even find work.
Right.
It was mostly domestic service or teaching. Healthcare was limited, especially for mothers.
Right.
And traditional gender roles were just deeply ingrained in society.
It sounds pretty bleak.
Yeah, it was a very patriarchal society.
Hmm.
It is surprising to learn that Cuba's 1940 constitution actually guaranteed workplace equality for women.
Really?
Yeah, but like so many well-intentioned laws,
Yeah.
it wasn't really enforced.
Oh, so the reality was quite different from what the law promised.
Exactly.
Okay.
A lot of times that's the case.
Right, and then bam, the revolution happens.
Yeah, 1959, everything changes.
And with it, the FMC is born?
Yes.
But you're telling me this wasn't some grassroots women's movement.
No, it's ironic, right? The FMC was actually created by the government
Mm-hmm.
to incorporate women into the socialist project.
Wow.
So this government-led entity became the main voice for women's rights in Cuba.
Interesting. How did that play out?
Oh.
Was the FMC just kind of pushing women into different versions of their existing roles?
Initially, yes. The FMC focused on mobilizing women in areas like health and education,
Okay.
essentially expanding their roles within those traditionally female spheres.
Right.
But things started to shift as the revolution progressed.
Okay.
One area that saw truly remarkable change was healthcare.
Okay.
The revolution brought about free healthcare for all Cubans,
Wow.
leading to a dramatic decrease in infant mortality
That's huge.
from 60 deaths per 1,000 births before the revolution to just 10 per 1,000 afterward.
That's incredible. Talk about tangible, like, life-changing progress.
Absolutely. A massive improvement that directly impacted families across Cuba.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And we see similar progress in education.
Okay.
Literacy rates for women skyrocketed.
Wow.
They gained greater access to higher education and
Mm.
professions like medicine.
Okay.
The number of female doctors, for example, jumped from a meager 6.5% before the revolution to a whopping 58% afterward.
Wow, 6.5% to 58%. That's huge.
Huge.
Did that lead to any pushback?
Within the medical profession?
Yeah, or in society at large. I mean, did people kind of,
Well, while the revolution did challenge traditional gender roles in some areas, it didn't completely dismantle them.
Okay.
Even with increased access to education, women were often steered toward traditionally female fields,
Like what?
like teaching, nursing, social work.
Interesting.
It's like, they open the door to a bigger room,
Yeah.
but you still find yourself confined to a specific corner of that room.
You get a taste of equality,
Yeah,
but you're still being subtly guided toward what's deemed suitable for your gender.
right.
What about the workplace?
Yeah.
Did the revolution's push for women to join the workforce actually translate into economic equality?
That's where we bump into this concept of the double burden.
Okay.
Women's participation in the workforce did increase, but there was still a gap between men and women.
Right.
The revolution needed women to help fuel economic growth, so they were encouraged to take on jobs.
Right.
But here's the catch. Even with jobs outside the home, women remained largely responsible for housework and childcare.
Second shift. Right.
It's what some call the second shift, exactly.
I can relate to that. Juggling work and family responsibilities, it's a lot.
Oh, absolutely.
So imagine that pressure in a society undergoing a radical transformation like the Cuban Revolution.
Exactly.
It's a classic example of how deeply ingrained cultural norms can kind of lag behind changes in policy or law.
Yeah.
It highlights the limits of just changing the economic system without addressing the underlying social and cultural dynamics.
100%.
So was the government aware of this double burden?
Yes.
Did they try and do anything to address it?
They did. They made attempts to ease the burden through things like daycares, laundry services, even boarding schools.
Hmm.
The idea was to create these systems that would help women manage both work and family.
Right.
However, these initiatives are often underfunded,
Oh, okay.
and they struggled with efficiency, so they didn't significantly lessen the load on women.
Good intentions, but not always the most effective execution.
Right, exactly.
It makes you wonder if those initiatives were truly designed to share the burden of parenting equally, or were they mostly about getting women into the workforce?
That's a debate that continues to this day.
Yeah.
Some argued that the government was more focused on boosting economic output than promoting genuine shared responsibility within families.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the 1975 Family Code.
Yes.
On paper, this seemed to address a lot of these inequalities,
Yeah, it
right?
did. The 1975 Family Code was a groundbreaking attempt to legally mandate equal sharing of chores and childcare between men and women.
Wow.
A truly progressive concept for its time.
For sure.
But the challenge, like with many well-intentioned laws, lay in enforcement.
Right.
Traditional gender roles proved stubbornly resistant,
Yeah.
and the reality within many families didn't always reflect the ideals outlined in the code.
We see this pattern emerging.
Yeah.
Progressive laws, but the reality on the ground is more complex.
Yeah, much more complex.
What about women in politics?
Yeah.
Did they gain a real seat at the table?
Well, superficially, it seems so.
Yeah.
Cuba boasts one of the highest proportions of women in parliament globally,
Wow.
a statistic that's often touted as evidence of the revolution's success in promoting women's leadership.
So a success story, right?
Not so fast.
Yeah.
While there were many women in parliament, the National Assembly itself had limited power compared to the Communist Party and the Council of State.
Okay.
And in those bodies, women remained significantly underrepresented.
It's like being invited to a meeting but realizing you're not actually part of the decision-making process.
Precisely.
Wow.
And this lack of representation in key political bodies is directly linked to the double burden we discussed earlier.
Right.
Women, already stretched thin between work and family obligations, simply didn't have the time or energy to take on demanding political roles.
Yeah.
There's even a quote from a male Cuban official who said that women were being protected from political responsibilities,
Protected.
a statement that speaks volumes about the prevailing mindset at the time.
Yeah, protected from actually having any real power.
Right.
It reinforces this idea that women are somehow less capable of handling those responsibilities.
It's a perfect example of how seemingly harmless language can perpetuate traditional gender roles.
Yeah, that's insidious.
A subtle form of paternalism that can be even more insidious than outright discrimination.
So the Cuban Revolution, with its Marxist ideology,
Right.
which views economic structures as the root of societal inequalities, aimed to create a more equitable society.
Right.
But as we've seen, the journey toward gender equality wasn't as straightforward as one might expect.
No, it wasn't.
The revolution brought about undeniable progress, particularly in education and healthcare.
Absolutely.
But the persistence of the double burden,
Yeah.
the limited power of women in politics,
Right.
and the enduring cultural norms around gender roles all point to a much more complex reality.
It's not a simple story.
Yeah.
It's very nuanced.
It seems that even within a socialist system, true equality requires more than just changes to the economic structure.
Mhm.
It demands a fundamental shift in mindset and a willingness to directly challenge those deeply ingrained patriarchal structures that permeate society.
That's a crucial insight.
Yeah.
It challenges us to consider whether true gender equality can be achieved without explicitly addressing the specific forms of oppression that women face,
Right.
regardless of the prevailing economic system.
Okay, so we've kind of set the stage.
Yeah.
We've explored some of the complexities of women's lives in revolutionary Cuba,
Uh-huh.
but there's still so much more to uncover.
Oh, yeah.
We'll dig into some specific examples that illustrate these tensions between the revolution's ideals and the reality for women in part 2.
Sounds good. Sometimes a single event can really highlight the complexities of a situation,
Okay.
like a crack in a seemingly perfect facade that reveals what's going on beneath the surface.
Okay, you've got me intrigued. What kind of event are you thinking of?
Let's look at the 1970 sugar harvest.
Okay.
Castro set this ambitious goal of producing 10 million tons of sugar.
10 million tons. Wow.
It was a massive undertaking that demanded all hands on deck,
Yeah.
and women were not exempt.
So how did this impact women specifically? We were just talking about how the revolution was pushing for them to join the workforce.
Well, during this massive push for sugar, many women were actually pulled out of their jobs and sent to the countryside to cut sugarcane.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
That seems to completely contradict the idea of promoting women's economic independence.
Exactly. It reveals how, in practice, the revolution's economic goals sometimes overshadowed its commitment to women's advancement.
Hmm.
It's like saying, we support you working, but only when it's convenient for us.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow, especially after all that talk about progress.
Right.
Did the FMC or any other groups push back against this?
There were definitely internal debates and discussions,
Mm-hmm.
but publicly, the FMC largely framed the sugar harvest as a patriotic duty
Hmm.
and even mobilized their members to participate.
It's a fascinating how the FMC had to navigate that space between advocating for women and supporting the government's agenda.
Yeah. It was a tricky situation.
How much autonomy did they really have?
That's a question historians continue to debate.
Yeah.
Was the FMC a genuine advocate for women's rights, or was it primarily a tool of the
All
state?
right.
It was likely a bit of both, operating within a very specific political context.
Yeah, it makes you think about the compromises that are sometimes made in the name of progress.
Absolutely.
And it reminds me of another event that sheds light on how women experienced the revolution.
Okay.
The Mariel boat lift of 1980,
I asked the Mariel boat lift.
when thousands of Cubans fled the island.
A mass exodus.
Yeah, fueled by economic hardship, political repression.
And a desire for greater freedom.
But there's also a strong gender dynamic to unpack here.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm all ears. How did this mass exodus relate to the experiences of women?
Well, the Cuban government had a particular narrative about those who left the island,
Okay.
labeling them as traitors, enemies of the revolution.
Right.
And this narrative was often deeply gendered, especially when it came to women.
What do you mean? Were women treated differently than men when they chose to leave?
Absolutely. Women who emigrated faced especially harsh criticism.
Hmm.
They were accused of abandoning their revolutionary duty,
Oh, wow.
of being selfish, of putting their desires above the needs of the nation.
That's harsh.
It was seen as a betrayal of their families, their communities, and their country.
Wow, talk about pressure.
Mm.
So for women, leaving wasn't just a political act, but like a violation of their expected role in society.
Exactly. It shows how deeply intertwined the revolution's ideology was with traditional notions of femininity and motherhood.
Okay.
Women were expected to be the guardians of the revolution's values, the upholders of its ideals.
It seems like they were held to a different standard than men, facing an extra layer of scrutiny and judgment.
For sure.
Hmm.
And this gendered narrative surrounding the Mariel boat lift had a lasting impact on Cuban society.
Yeah.
It reinforced the idea that women who sought a different life,
Uh-huh.
a life outside of Cuba, were somehow less patriotic, less committed to the revolution.
Less Cuban, almost.
The irony is that many of these women were simply seeking the freedoms and opportunities that the revolution had promised but failed to deliver.
Yeah, the very things they were supposedly fighting for.
Exactly.
It's a stark reminder that even in a system claiming to champion equality, those traditional gender roles and expectations can persist.
Yeah, they can be woven into the very fabric of society.
And these narratives weren't just imposed from above, right?
No, they were often internalized by women themselves,
Wow.
shaping their self-perceptions and their understanding of their place in the world.
It makes you realize that changing laws and policies is only one part of the equation.
Right.
The real challenge lies in transforming those deeply ingrained cultural attitudes and beliefs.
Absolutely. And that transformation requires open dialogue,
Yeah.
critical reflection, a willingness to challenge the status quo.
It's a process that can take generations. So we've seen how events like the sugar harvest and the Mariel boat lift expose the limitations of the revolution's approach to gender equality.
Yeah, they really highlight those complexities.
But Cuba wasn't operating in a vacuum, right?
No, of course not.
What about the influence of other countries? How did the global landscape impact their journey?
That's an important point. Cuba, despite its isolation, was still part of a larger global conversation.
Right.
One major influence was the Soviet Union, Cuba's main ally and economic lifeline during the Cold War.
Ah, yes, the Cold War context.
Right.
So how did the Soviet Union's model of gender equality, or lack thereof, influence Cuba?
Well, the Soviet Union had its own complex history with women's rights.
Okay.
On one hand, they made strides in areas like education and employment,
Uh-huh.
but on the other hand, they still very much emphasized women's traditional roles as mothers and homemakers.
Okay.
Their model was about incorporating women into the workforce,
Right.
but within the framework of those traditional family structures.
So not quite the feminist utopia one might imagine?
Exactly, and the Soviet model had a direct impact on Cuba.
Okay.
They shared similar views on the role of women in a socialist society,
Hmm.
both emphasizing women's participation in the workforce while upholding the sanctity of the family unit.
So was Cuba simply replicating the Soviet model?
Not exactly. They adapted it to fit their own circumstances and cultural context.
Okay.
But there's no denying that the Soviet Union's influence was significant.
What about other influences? Did the global feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s have any impact on Cuba?
It's complicated.
Ugh.
The Cuban government was often critical of Western feminism,
Hmm.
viewing it as a bourgeois movement out of touch with the realities of working-class women.
Interesting.
They believed true liberation could only come through socialist revolution,
Right.
not through these individualistic feminist agendas.
So a bit of a clash of ideologies then.
In some ways, yes.
Okay.
But there were also points of intersection and dialogue.
Hmm.
The FMC, for example, participated in international women's conferences and engaged with feminist ideas from other parts of the world.
Okay.
They weren't completely closed off to outside influences.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act,
Yeah,
navigating the tensions between their revolutionary ideology and the evolving global conversation on women's rights.
exactly. And this theme of balancing act kind of runs throughout the history of the Cuban Revolution.
Yeah.
They were constantly trying to forge their own paths,
Right.
drawing inspiration from different sources while asserting their unique identity.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah.
Full of twists and turns, we've explored some of the complexities of women's lives in revolutionary Cuba,
We have,
uncovering both the progress made and the limitations encountered.
for sure.
But we're not done yet. In our final segment, we'll delve into the enduring legacies of the Cuban Revolution for women.
Okay.
What are the key takeaways from this deep dive, and what lessons can be learned from the Cuban experience? Stay with us. Okay, so we've gone through this journey through the revolution. We've explored the peaks and valleys, the promises and the realities of women's lives in Cuba.
Right.
Now for the big question. What does it all mean?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we extract meaning from this intricate kind of web of historical events
Yeah.
and human experiences?
Exactly. We can't just leave our listeners hanging, right?
No, we can't.
Help us connect the dots.
Okay.
What are the key takeaways? What did the Cuban Revolution really achieve for women?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the undeniable progress that was made in
Yeah.
certain areas.
Yeah.
As we've discussed, education and healthcare saw some truly transformative changes.
Right.
Literacy rates for women skyrocketed, access to higher education expanded,
Uh-huh.
and healthcare became a right for all.
Yeah.
These were monumental victories that had a profound impact on women's lives.
Absolutely. It's easy to get lost in the nuances, but we can't forget about those fundamental achievements.
Exactly. These changes created real opportunities for countless Cuban women.
But as we've seen throughout this deep dive,
Yeah.
the revolution's impact on women wasn't a straightforward success story, right?
Right.
Where did it fall short?
Well, one major area was the persistence of the double burden.
Mm,
Despite attempts to, collectivize domestic labor,
right.
women remained disproportionately responsible for housework and childcare.
Right.
And this limited their ability to, fully participate in the workforce
Yeah.
and advance in their careers.
That second shift just wouldn't budge, would it?
It's tough.
It shows that even when you radically change the economic system,
Yeah.
those ingrained cultural norms, those societal expectations, they can be incredibly hard to shake.
You nailed it.
It's a reminder that true equality requires more than just changing laws and structures.
Right.
It demands a shift in mindsets, in
Uh-huh.
behaviors.
Absolutely.
And what about political representation?
Yeah.
We talked about how women held a significant number of seats in parliament, but what about real decision-making power?
Yeah, that's another area where the revolution fell short of its promises.
Okay,
While there were many women in parliament, the National Assembly itself had limited power
right.
compared to the Communist Party and the Council of State.
Okay.
And in those bodies, women remained significantly underrepresented.
So the image of equality wasn't quite as rosy as it first appeared.
No, it wasn't.
It's a reminder that representation
Yeah,
without real power
Right.
is ultimately an empty gesture.
exactly. True equality means having a voice at every level of decision-making.
So despite the revolution's rhetoric
Yeah.
about ending discrimination, full gender equality remained elusive.
You did.
It's a powerful lesson
Yeah,
that even the most well-intentioned revolutions
right.
can have unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
Creating a truly equitable society demands a multifaceted approach
Uh-huh.
that addresses not just economic structures, but also
Right.
deeply embedded cultural attitudes and power dynamics.
It has to be holistic. It can't just be one thing. It
Yeah.
has to be, a number of different approaches.
Right, right. So what can we learn from the Cuban experience? What insights can we apply to our own understanding of the fight for gender equality today?
Well, one key takeaway is that simply changing the economic system isn't enough to dismantle patriarchy.
Right.
It's a deeply rooted system of beliefs and practices
Yeah.
that needs to be addressed directly.
Like trying to build a house on a shaky foundation.
Right.
Yeah. You might have a flashy new structure, but it's not going to stand the test of time.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
The Cuban experience also highlights the importance of women having their own independent organizations.
Okay.
While the FMC played a significant role in advancing women's rights,
Uh-huh.
their close ties to the government sometimes limited their ability to act autonomously.
Yeah, that age-old tension between collaboration and co-option.
Exactly.
It's a difficult balance to strike.
Indeed. And finally, I think the Cuban Revolution reminds us that social change is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
It takes patience, takes persistence,
Hmm.
and a willingness to learn from both successes and setbacks.
It's an ongoing journey that requires our constant attention and commitment.
Exactly. The Cuban Revolution, with all its complexities and contradictions,
Yeah.
offers valuable lessons for anyone striving for a more just and equitable world.
It's a story that continues to unfold both in Cuba and beyond.
Absolutely.
And as you continue your own exploration of these issues, we'll leave you with this final thought.
Right.
What does true equality look like to you? And what role can you play in making it a reality?
Good questions.
Keep questioning, keep learning,
Yeah.
and keep pushing for a better world.
Beautifully said. Until next time.